At 9:15 a.m. sharp, the heavy doors of the courtroom swung open, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. Catherine Vale, a name that had dominated Rhode Island legal circles and morning talk shows alike, entered with the kind of presence that demanded attention rather than requested it. Her heels struck the floor like a metronome of authority, crisp, confident, and absolutely unapologetic. She wore a flawlessly cut gray suit, an emerald scarf wrapped neatly at her throat, and a stare sharp enough to cut through silence. In one hand, she gripped a briefcase polished bright enough to reflect the overhead lights. In the other, a phone lit up with messages from frantic clients and two impatient TV producers. But today, Catherine Vale wasn't the celebrated attorney. Today, she was the defendant, and everyone in that courtroom knew exactly why. 2 weeks earlier, she had found herself in the center of a public storm after an explosive confrontation in a school zone, charged with contempt of court, interfering with a traffic officer, and reckless endangerment. Her downfall had been sealed by a single viral moment, one brazen line spoken straight to a police officer. "You don't ticket me. I write the law." The video had exploded online, racking up more than 4 million views, sparking debates, outrage, memes, and late-night comedy jokes. Yet when she finally stood before Judge Frank Caprio, Catherine didn't look shaken, ashamed, or even mildly concerned. She looked entertained. To her, this wasn't a reckoning. It was another stage, another audience, another chance to prove she still controlled the narrative, just like she always had. Before we dive into this shocking courtroom showdown, make sure you hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is one of the most unbelievable moments ever seen in Providence Municipal Court.
The gallery, packed with curious locals, stirred as she passed. People whispered, recognizing her from televised interviews where she'd once lectured about legal ethics. Now they whispered words like arrogance, downfall, karma. She ignored them all. To her, the courtroom was a stage she had walked across 100 times before. The only difference today was that the spotlight had shifted. Judge Caprio looked up from the bench as the clerk called her case. The State of Rhode Island versus Catherine Vale. His tone was calm, patient, professional. Catherine barely glanced at him. She remained standing when instructed to sit, flipping open her case file as though she were the one presiding. "Good morning, Ms. Vale," Caprio began evenly. "You are representing yourself, is that correct?" She smiled without warmth. "Of course, Your Honor, I'm more than qualified." The words carried a polished arrogance, an undercurrent of mockery just sharp enough for the courtroom microphones to catch. Caprio nodded once, unbothered. "Then we'll proceed accordingly." Catherine leaned slightly forward, tone clipped and rehearsed. "Before we proceed, I must note for the record that this summons is procedurally flawed. The officer filed the citation incorrectly and technically—" Caprio raised a hand gently. "Miss Vale, before we discuss procedure, we'll address the charges." Her eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, Judge, I know the law better than most who sit behind that bench." The gallery shifted. Even the bailiff's stance changed, spine straightening, ready. Caprio's expression didn't move. He had seen fury, fear, desperation, but arrogance from lawyers was a rarer species. He let her words hang for a moment, long enough for the silence to start pressing in. Then, in his quiet, unflappable way, he answered, "Then this will be an educational hearing for us both." The remark landed like the first roll of distant thunder. No raised voice, no argument, just control. Absolute, grounded authority that seemed to draw the air out of the room. Catherine tilted her chin, a smirk flickering. "Let's hope you can keep up." The clerk began reading the charges aloud. The first, failure to yield to a crossing officer. The second, obstruction of traffic during school hours. The third, verbal intimidation of a public official while displaying legal credentials. Each phrase tightened the courtroom atmosphere further, like strings wound too tight. When asked for her plea, she responded crisply, "Not guilty," and, if I may add, insulted by the premise. "Noted," Caprio replied. He flipped a page on the docket. "Miss Vale, as an attorney, you understand the importance of decorum in this setting." She crossed her arms. "I understand the importance of fairness. That's what I'm here to restore." A faint murmur spread through the benches. Even those who had come expecting spectacle now sensed something heavier. A clash not between judge and defendant, but between justice and ego. Caprio regarded her steadily. "You believe fairness has been denied?" "I believe," she said, every syllable deliberate, "that this court is being used
as a stage to humiliate me because of a viral video. I don't answer to mobs or cameras. I answer to the law." Caprio's voice stayed calm. "And yet here you are, summoned by it." The line drew a ripple through the audience. Catherine's expression hardened, but a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. Caprio opened the case folder. "The video in question shows you using your legal ID to obstruct an officer in front of children leaving a school. Do you deny that?" "I exercised my right to challenge an unlawful citation by standing in a crosswalk and shouting at an officer for 9 minutes." Catherine's jaw tensed. "Out of context." Caprio nodded slightly. "Context can be helpful. We'll review it." For a brief moment, Catherine's confidence wavered. Then she forced a laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. "Your Honor, you can play whatever recording you want. It doesn't change the fact that the citation was baseless." Caprio leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "We're not here to judge the citation, counselor. We're here to judge conduct. Yours." The air thickened again. Catherine's smirk faltered. Caprio's voice lowered, not as threat, but as truth. "In this courtroom, Miss Vale, your title means nothing. Your actions mean everything." The clerk typed quietly, the sound filling the space like ticking clocks. Catherine adjusted her scarf, suddenly too tight around her neck. The arrogance that had marched in with her still flickered, but it was dimmer now, its flame met by something colder, older, immovable. For the first time, she realized she wasn't cross-examining a witness. She was the witness, and every word was being recorded in the court of public conscience. The silence stretched. Then Judge Caprio spoke once more, softly but decisively. "Let's begin with the evidence." And in that instant, even Catherine Vale, the attorney who believed no one could ever school her in the law, felt the walls of justice begin to close in. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Judge Caprio folded his hands neatly on the bench, the posture of a man who understood that silence could discipline far more than shouting ever could. Before him, Catherine Vale stood at the defendant's table, chin high, face composed, the posture of someone who had mistaken composure for control. "The court will now review the evidence," Caprio said. The clerk tapped a key, and the monitor beside the bench flickered to life. The first still image appeared. Catherine's black sedan stopped squarely in the middle of a painted crosswalk, hazard lights flashing. A uniformed officer stood beside the window, gesturing for her to move. The timestamp read 3:18, dismissal hour for the nearby elementary school. Children could be seen waiting at the curb. "Miss Vale," Caprio began evenly, "is that your vehicle?"
Catherine didn't look at the screen. "It appears to be. And the location. Downtown, near my office." Caprio nodded. "Near your office, not your parking space. Not a designated zone, but a crosswalk? And the children.
They were supervised, she answered quickly. No one was in danger. The next image appeared, a wider shot. The officer now stood farther from the vehicle, hand on his radio. The children still waited, clutching backpacks, glancing toward the commotion. No one was in danger, Caprio repeated softly. Would you say that to their parents? A murmur spread across the courtroom benches. Catherine's eyes flicked to the monitor, then back to the judge. Your Honor, I didn't intend any harm. The officer's reaction was excessive. Excessive. Yes, she said sharply. I was explaining the law, not resisting it. He nodded slowly. Then we'll let the recording speak for itself. The video began to play. The courtroom speakers filled with the crisp audio of an afternoon breeze, children's chatter, and Catherine's unmistakable voice, sharp, commanding, dripping with authority. You can't tag me for this. I'm an attorney. Do you even know what section of the statute you're quoting? The officer's voice, calm but strained, answered, Ma'am, please move the vehicle. You're blocking the crosswalk during school hours. Catherine's reply sliced through the air. Then learn the law before you try enforcing it. The gallery winced collectively, the kind of shared discomfort that tightens throats. Even Catherine's face, once smug, now tensed under the weight of her own words. The video continued. She waved her legal ID at the officer. You see this? This means I know my rights, and you're wasting my time. Caprio stopped the playback with a quiet gesture. That's sufficient. His voice wasn't angry. It was heavier than anger. Ms. Vale, do you dispute that the words spoken were yours? She hesitated only a moment too long. I was frustrated, Your Honor. Everyone loses their temper sometimes. Frustration is human, Caprio agreed. Abuse of authority is not. I didn't abuse, he cut her off with a look. Not loud, not harsh, just final. You waved your professional credentials like a shield against accountability. Tell me, counselor, when did law become your armor instead of your duty? The words hung in the air. Catherine exhaled through her nose, hands tightening around her pen. I was being harassed. That officer was rude. Caprio opened the file again. Officer Duran's report states that you refused to comply, called him a glorified meter maid, and blocked a marked crossing for 11 minutes. That's exaggerated. Body cam timestamps rarely exaggerate. Her face reddened, the heat of her own logic turning against her. Then charge me with disrespect, not endangerment. Caprio leaned back, his tone measured. You've been in courtrooms long enough to know that contempt isn't about volume. It's about intent. You disrespected an officer of the law while children waited to cross the street. That's not a misstep, Ms. Vale. That's arrogance with consequences. The courtroom was quiet enough that even the faint scratch of his pen against paper sounded like thunder. She drew a slow breath, regaining her composure. With respect, Judge, this feels personal. You've made up your mind because of a viral video. Caprio didn't flinch. The internet may judge by virality, Ms. Vale. I judge by record. He gestured to the clerk, who handed him a stack of papers. According to this, you've received 5 previous citations for similar conduct, 2 for arguing with parking enforcement, 3 for obstructing officers during official duties. Were all of them personal, too? Catherine stiffened. Those were misunderstandings. 5 misunderstandings. His tone was quiet, but cutting. The law allows mistakes. It does not tolerate patterns. She said nothing. Her eyes darted toward the courtroom exit as though calculating distance. Caprio noticed. Leaving won't erase what's already on the record, he said calmly. You've built your career defending others. Yet here you stand unable to defend your own behavior without blaming everyone else. That's unfair. What's unfair? Caprio replied, voice low, is that the same law you used to protect others, you weaponized for your convenience. Her mouth opened, then closed. The silence afterward felt like a verdict all its own. Caprio leaned forward slightly. Ms. Vale, tell me, What message do you think a child watching that video learns from your example? Her answer came too quickly. They'd learn that even authority can be questioned. Authority, he said softly, can be questioned. Integrity cannot. For a moment, even the sound of shuffling papers stopped. Catherine looked at him, really looked, for the first time that morning. The mask of control was still there, but a crack had begun to show. Caprio turned a page. You've practiced law for 12 years. You've represented clients who faced harsher words than yours, harsher judgments than this. But arrogance, Ms. Vale, has a way of turning knowledge into blindness. Her lips pressed into a thin line. If this court intends to make an example of me? No, he interrupted. This court intends to remind you that you are still human. The gavel didn't strike. It didn't need to. The words themselves drew the boundary. For the first time since the proceedings began, Catherine's confidence faltered. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers, the neat columns of her notes suddenly meaningless, and Judge Caprio, patient as the tide, simply said, "We will continue this examination after recess. Perhaps humility will find its way into counsel's argument by then." The bailiff called the break. Chairs scraped softly as people rose, but Catherine remained seated, staring at the darkened monitor. The courtroom that once felt like her arena now felt like a mirror, and for the first time in her career she didn't like what it showed. When the recess ended, Catherine Vale returned to the courtroom slower than before. The same confidence was there in her posture, but something in the rhythm of her steps had changed. Less a march, more a negotiation with herself. The chatter in the gallery quieted as Judge Caprio took his seat. He didn't look at her right away. He finished signing a form, placed his pen down neatly, and only then raised his eyes. "Miss Vale," he said, calm as ever, "you may continue your defense." She drew a steady breath. "Your Honor, I acknowledge my words that day were harsh, but my intent wasn't contempt. The officer's actions were." Caprio interrupted with a motion to the clerk. "Play Exhibit B." The screen came alive again. A short clip filmed by a passerby captured her pacing beside her car, voice sharp enough to slice through traffic. "Write that ticket and I'll see you in court. I could argue circles around you before you finish your paperwork," she barked. The clip ended on her slamming the car door and speeding away. Caprio's tone was quiet, but relentless. "That wasn't an officer's body cam, Miss Vale. That was the phone of a parent waiting to cross with her child. She sent it directly to the city attorney's office. Would you like to tell this court why she described you as the lawyer who thought she was above the law?" Catherine stared at the table. "People exaggerate online." "Then let's take this offline," he said. "Look at me." She hesitated before meeting his eyes. The mask of certainty she wore began to slip under the weight of the judge's silence. "You've spent years advocating for due process," Caprio continued. "Yet when it was your turn to face it, you mocked it. Why?" Her voice cracked for the first time. "Because it wasn't fair." "Fairness." His eyebrow lifted. "You shouted at a public servant and blocked children from crossing a street, then invoked your profession as protection. What part of that should this court consider fair?" Catherine's hands trembled. She forced them still by gripping the edge of the table. "You wouldn't understand," she said, but her tone had lost its edge. It was defensive, almost pleading. "Then help me understand," Caprio said softly. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering words she hadn't meant to say aloud. "2 years ago," she began slowly, "I represented a woman in a wrongful death case. A driver hit her husband, killed him instantly. We lost on a technicality. The defense attorney twisted a filing date by 1 day. The man responsible walked free. And my client, she looked at me like I'd betrayed her. Since then, every citation, every argument, it all felt pointless. The system doesn't care who's right, it only cares who wins." The courtroom stilled. The arrogance that had filled her voice earlier was gone, replaced by something rawer, disillusionment worn down to exhaustion. Caprio's reply came gently, but it cut deeper than reprimand. The law doesn't promise perfection, Miss Vale. It promises the chance to try again without vengeance. She blinked hard, anger flickering. So what? I'm supposed to smile while incompetence rules the street?
No, he said. You're supposed to remember why you entered this profession in the first place. Justice isn't a competition. It's a responsibility. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples spread through every listener. Caprio turned another page in her file. You've been disciplined twice for professional discourtesy. Once to a court clerk, once to opposing counsel. Both dismissed with warnings. Tell me, Miss Vale, when did your confidence become contempt? She didn't answer. Her throat worked as though the truth were lodged there. The judge's tone softened again. You were raised by educators, weren't you? Catherine's eyes widened. How do you know that? It's in your bio from the Bar Association. 2 teachers from Cranston. You wrote that they taught you to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Is that still true? The question disarmed her completely. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Because, Caprio continued, what you showed that officer wasn't speech. It was superiority. There's a difference. The gallery was silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the steady rhythm of the judge's voice, gentle but unyielding. I've spent 40 years in this chair, he said. I've seen anger, grief, arrogance, fear. But the moment a person starts believing their title protects them from humility, that's when the law stops being their profession and becomes their weapon. Catherine swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But it did. Her shoulders slumped. The scarf around her neck seemed tighter now. I was tired, she said quietly. Tired of being treated like a machine that's supposed to fix everything for everyone else. Caprio nodded slowly. That exhaustion is human, but humanity is what the law is meant to serve, not escape. For several seconds the courtroom held its breath. Even the bailiff looked down, pretending to check his notes. Finally, Caprio broke the silence. Miss Vale, I believe the law can still restore you if you'll let it. But first, we must finish confronting the truth. He motioned to the clerk. A final exhibit appeared on the monitor, a written complaint from the officer involved in the crosswalk incident. It wasn't angry or vindictive. It read, I don't want her punished. I just want her to remember that respect runs both ways. Catherine's eyes lingered on the sentence. Her lips parted, then closed again. Caprio's tone was nearly a whisper. He gave you the grace you refused to give him. Tears welled, but she blinked them back. I don't deserve grace. None of us do, the judge said softly. That's why it's called mercy. For the first time since she'd entered, Catherine didn't argue. She nodded, barely perceptible, but real. Then we'll begin the final phase, Caprio said. The court will deliberate sentencing after reviewing your full record. She lowered her gaze, voice barely audible. I understand, Your Honor. And in that quiet acceptance, the courtroom felt the shift, the sound of pride breaking softly instead of shattering. The final hearing resumed the next morning. The courtroom was full again. Law students, officers, citizens who had watched the viral clip and returned now to witness its ending. But the energy had changed. Gone was the crackle of curiosity, the hunger for spectacle. In its place was the quiet hum of anticipation, the sense that something heavier than punishment was about to unfold. Catherine Vale entered differently this time. No emerald scarf, no polished briefcase, just a plain black blazer and the faint look of someone who hadn't slept much. She carried nothing in her hands, not a phone, not a folder, not a single document to hide behind. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her expression, once a smirk carved in stone, was subdued, reflective, almost uncertain. Judge Caprio lifted his head when she entered. "Good morning, Miss Vale." "Good morning, Your Honor," she said quietly, and this time she meant it. He nodded to the clerk. "We are reconvening on the matter of the state versus Catherine Vale. The defendant has had an opportunity to review the evidence and consider her prior conduct. Ms. Vale, do you have any final statement before sentencing?" She hesitated, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She straightened slightly, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the room. "I spent my career believing the law was a weapon to win with. I forgot that it's supposed to be a service to others. I can't excuse how I acted that day or the disrespect I showed. Not to the officer, not to this court, and not to the people watching who believed I represented justice. I used my position to protect my pride instead of my principles. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want the chance to learn how to practice the law without forgetting why I started." Caprio listened without interruption. When she finished, he remained still for several seconds, letting the silence settle like dust in sunlight. Then, softly, he began. "Ms. Vale," he said, "I've reviewed your record, your years of service, and the footage from that day. You've defended the poor, the forgotten, and the voiceless. But somewhere along the way you forgot that humility is part of the oath you took. You became fluent in law and illiterate in empathy." Catherine lowered her gaze. He continued, voice deepening but never rising. "You tell me you want to learn again. That's good, because what I'm about to impose isn't meant to break you. It's meant to rebuild you." The gallery leaned forward. "The court sentences you to pay the maximum fine allowed under Rhode Island statute for obstruction and reckless endangerment. Your driver's license will be suspended for 6 months. But more importantly, I am ordering 100 hours of community service at the Public Defender's Office, not as counsel, but as assistant support staff. You will handle intake forms, answer phones, and assist those who cannot afford legal representation. You will see up close what the law feels like from the other side of the table." Catherine blinked, shocked, not by the severity, but by the meaning. "Yes, Your Honor." Caprio wasn't done. "In addition, this court will refer your conduct to the Rhode Island Bar Association for review. You will submit a written reflection to the Ethics Committee, 700 words your own, titled The Weight of the Gavel. What I Forgot About Justice. It will be public record." A murmur spread through the gallery. Some gasped, some nodded. Caprio raised a hand for silence. "This isn't humiliation, it's transparency, because the public deserves to see that accountability isn't reserved for the powerless." Catherine's lips trembled, but she nodded slowly. "Understood, Your Honor." He looked at her for a long moment before delivering the line that would later echo across millions of screens. "In this court," he said softly, "the law is not a crown you wear. It's a mirror that shows who you are." The room went still. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the clerks paused mid-keystroke. Caprio continued, "You came in here certain that your knowledge placed you above consequence. But knowledge without humility is the same as speed without brakes. It only looks powerful until the crash." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away this time. "Your punishment is not jail, Miss Vale. It's proximity to the very people you once overlooked. When you sit beside a defendant who trembles because they cannot afford counsel, remember what it felt like to tremble here. That is how justice teaches." He paused, then leaned back, letting the words breathe. "I believe you will do good again, but never forget this day. Arrogance is not strength, it's the shadow that hides it." Catherine's voice cracked.
"I won't forget, Your Honor. I promise." The gavel came down once, quiet, final echoing, more like a prayer than a blow. But the story didn't end there. Over the following weeks, the court's clerk room became her new arena. She answered phones for people desperate for help. She filed paperwork for those who had no one else to listen. The same hands that once signed legal briefs now stapled forms and piasked pens to nervous strangers. She didn't speak of her old titles. When people recognized her from the viral clip, she only said, "That was me, before I learned what law really means." By the end of her service, something in her posture had changed. The arrogance that once filled her shoulders was replaced by quiet purpose. And when Judge Caprio later received her reflection essay, he read the first line twice. Justice isn't the power to win an argument. It's the grace to admit when you've lost yourself. At the next ethics review, Catherine Vale stood before the board, not defiant, not ashamed, but honest. The recommendation, full reinstatement. The chairwoman noted that her written reflection had already been read in law schools
across 3 states. Months later, she returned to Caprio's courtroom not as a defendant, but as an observer. When proceedings ended, she quietly approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, "thank you for the mirror." Caprio smiled faintly. "Mirrors don't judge, Miss Vale. They revealed the truth, and what she chose to do with that truth was now entirely her own." Catherine nodded, her eyes bright with something new. "Then I hope," she said quietly, "that one day I can reflect what you showed me today." As she walked toward the exit, the clerk noticed a thin beam of sunlight slip through the towering courthouse windows. Dust floated in the light, shimmering like tiny pieces of something finally loosening, finally breaking free. Outside, the cameras were waiting again, a wall of questions and noise. But this time, she didn't run, she didn't hide. She simply stopped. She took one question, only one, and answered it with a calm, almost grateful smile. "Yes," she said, "the sentence was fair." Back inside, Judge Frank Caprio gently closed the file, his voice low enough that only the bailiff standing beside him could hear. "Justice isn't about breaking someone's pride," he said softly. "It's about reminding pride when it's time to kneel." The echo of the gavel faded into the still morning light, but the lesson didn't fade with it. It lingered, quiet, powerful, unforgettable. Because in Judge Caprio's courtroom, justice was never just a ruling. It was a reminder of humanity, a balance of mercy and accountability, a place where dignity was restored, not erased. And that is the legacy he leaves behind. A lifetime spent proving that justice is strongest when delivered with compassion. Before you leave, don't forget to hit subscribe to Case Closed. Your support helps bring more real stories of justice, humility, and redemption. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from?